The grand ballroom of the Regent Beverly Hotel glittered with opulence. A massive crystal chandelier cast golden light over the sea of high society elites, draped in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. The annual Hope for Tomorrow charity gala was one of the most exclusive events of the year, an affair where the wealthy flaunted their generosity, not for the sake of giving, but for the prestige that came with it. At the center of the room stood Sandra Bullock, elegant as ever in a sleek black evening gown. She had arrived alone, wearing minimal jewelry, her natural grace making up for the lack of ostentation. Unlike many of the attendees, Sandra truly cared about the cause. The night was meant to raise funds for underprivileged children, a mission she had supported for years. But in this crowd, sincerity was rare. Across the ballroom, a trio of women eyed her with thinly veiled disdain. Vivian Kensington, a wealthy socialite known for her sharp tongue, led the pack. Dressed in an over-the-top gold ensemble, she sipped champagne as she whispered to her friends, Lydia Harrington and Eleanor Beaumont, both heiresses to old money empires. "Oh, look who decided to grace us with her presence," Vivian smirked, her voice dripping with condescension. Sandra Bullock, still dressing like she walked in from a budget film set. Lydia giggled. "She tries so hard to fit in, doesn't she? It's cute." Eleanor scoffed. "Darling, it's tragic. She should know by now. Money may get you through the door, but it doesn't buy class." Sandra, overhearing their whispers, chose to ignore them. She had dealt with these types before. Women who measured worth by social standing, mistaking cruelty for charm. But then came the final blow. "I heard she's here alone," Vivian sneered. "Shame. Maybe if she had real connections, she wouldn't have to beg her way into these events." The women erupted into hushed laughter. Sandra clenched her jaw, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. She had always believed that dignity lay in restraint, but tonight, restraint felt particularly difficult. What none of them knew, what none of them could have ever expected, was that someone very special had just walked in. Tom Cruise. And he had heard everything. Tom Cruise had arrived unannounced. Unlike the rest of the A-listers who made a grand entrance, pausing for photo ops and reveling in the spotlight, he preferred to move quietly, observing the room before making his presence known. His tailored navy suit was understated yet effortlessly stylish, his signature charm exuding confidence without arrogance. He had attended the Hope for Tomorrow charity gala before, but tonight wasn't about business or socializing. It was about genuine philanthropy. Tom had a personal connection to the cause, though few knew it. He had discreetly donated millions over the years, funding scholarships and shelters for underprivileged youth. Unlike most attendees, he wasn't here for status. He was here because he cared. And that's why, as he made his way through the ballroom, he noticed everything. He saw the way Sandra Bullock stood alone, poised but clearly targeted. He saw the insincere smiles and the whispers that followed her, the smug glances exchanged by Vivian Kensington and her entourage. He knew this game all too well, the shallow world of the elite, where wealth determined worth, and kindness was mistaken for weakness. Tom's expression remained neutral, but his sharp blue eyes flickered with something dangerous. He wasn't one to tolerate cruelty, especially not toward someone as gracious and accomplished as Sandra Bullock. Meanwhile, Sandra remained composed, but beneath the surface she was weary. It wasn't the first time she had been treated this way by the so-called elite, and she doubted it would be the last. Hollywood had its fair share of fake smiles and hidden daggers, but at these high society events, the claws came out in the open. Vivian, sensing that her words had landed, took another slow sip of champagne before strutting closer, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. "You know, Sandra," she began, voice silky with false sweetness, "it's admirable that you still show up to these events. Not everyone can blend in so seamlessly when they're so out of place." Lydia smirked. Eleanor hid a laugh behind her manicured hand. Sandra exhaled quietly. She had learned long ago that silence was often the best response to insecurity, wrapped in designer labels. But before she could walk away, a deep, unmistakable voice cut through the tension. "I think she fits in just fine." The room shifted. Heads turned. A wave of recognition rippled through the crowd. Sandra's eyes widened slightly. Vivian's smug expression faltered, because standing behind them, looking utterly unbothered yet completely in control, was none other than Tom Cruise. And he had just declared his allegiance. A heavy silence settled over the ballroom. For the first time that evening, Vivian Kensington was speechless. Lydia and Eleanor exchanged wide-eyed glances, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. Tom Cruise, Hollywood's biggest star, a man who could have spoken to anyone in the room, had just defended Sandra Bullock. Vivian quickly recovered, letting out a small, forced laugh. "Oh, Tom, we didn't see you there." Tom offered a polite, unreadable smile. "Didn't seem like you were looking." His tone was casual, but his words cut through the air like a knife. Sandra, still processing, turned toward him. His presence had changed everything in an instant. She wasn't the type to need saving. She had handled worse before. But there was something about the way he had stepped in, so effortlessly, so decisively, that made her feel seen. Vivian, determined to regain control, flipped her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. "We were just having a little chat," she said smoothly. "You know how these events are, all in good fun." Tom's eyes didn't waver. "Funny," he said, tilting his head slightly. Didn't seem like Sandra was having much fun. The tension in the air was suffocating. Sandra finally found her voice. She wasn't about to stand idly by while Tom fought her battles. "It's all right," she said, offering a tight smile. "Some people just mistake rudeness for charm." Vivian's lips pressed together. That was a hit, and they all knew it. Before Vivian could retaliate, the event organizer took the stage, tapping the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The evening's program is about to begin." The crowd slowly dispersed toward their tables, the energy shifting but not forgotten. Vivian shot Sandra a final, icy glare before walking off with her entourage, whispering furiously under her breath. Sandra exhaled. "Well," she murmured to Tom. "That was dramatic." He chuckled, his expression softening. "I don't think they liked my entrance." She turned to face him fully. "I appreciate it though. Really." Tom met her gaze. There was sincerity there. A quiet understanding between two people who had both navigated the industry's highs and lows. But their moment was short-lived. Because across the room, Vivian was plotting. She had been embarrassed in front of Tom Cruise, a man she had desperately tried to impress in past events, only to be overlooked every time. And Sandra Bullock, of all people, had been the reason for it. That was unacceptable. "Ladies," she hissed to Lydia and Eleanor as they took their seats. "We're not letting her walk out of here with the upper hand." Lydia leaned in eagerly. "What are we doing?" Vivian's lips curled into a slow, calculating smile. "We're making sure by the end of the night, she's the one who feels out of place." The next phase of the night began, a lavish three-course dinner, where guests were expected to bid on high-value auction items for charity. The atmosphere had shifted slightly, but Sandra knew how these things worked. Vivian wasn't done. She could feel it. And she was right. As the first auction item, a rare painting, was announced, Vivian leaned forward with a saccharine smile. "Sandra, darling," she purred, loud enough for several tables to hear. "You should place a bid." "Oh, but," she feigned a look of concern. "I'm not sure it's in your budget." Sandra stiffened. The undercurrent of mockery was clear. Tom, however, beat her to the punch. "That's funny, Vivian. Because I'm pretty sure Sandra could buy every table in this ballroom if she wanted to." Gasps. A few suppressed laughs. Vivian's face turned a shade paler, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, Tom," she laughed. "Always so charming." Tom didn't respond. He just smiled. The kind of smile that made it clear he wasn't playing her game. But Vivian wasn't backing down. Not yet. As the auction continued, she had one last move planned. Something that would humiliate Sandra in front of everyone. And she was just waiting for the right moment. The night carried on, but the energy in the room had shifted. Vivian Kensington, still stewing from Tom Cruise's effortless takedown, was determined to strike back. If she couldn't embarrass Sandra Bullock directly, she'd do something even better. She'd make her feel insignificant. As the auction continued, the bids climbed higher and higher. Luxury vacations, rare artifacts, and even a private yacht experience were up for grabs, each selling for obscene amounts of money. Sandra sat quietly at her table, politely clapping as the numbers soared. She had no intention of playing into Vivian's game. She wasn't here to flaunt wealth. She was here for the cause. But Vivian wasn't about to let that happen. As the next item was announced, a handcrafted diamond necklace worn by royalty, Vivian leaned back in her chair, her voice dripping with amusement. Sandra, you must bid on this one. A classic piece just like you. Her entourage giggled. Lydia covered her smirk behind a champagne flute. Sandra inhaled slowly, keeping her composure. She knew exactly what this was, a public test of her status. Vivian was betting that Sandra wouldn't dare enter the bidding war, proving that she didn't belong among them. And if Sandra refused, it would only fuel their whispers. She was about to respond when, I'll place the first bid. The voice was Tom's. The room stilled. Sandra turned to him, eyes widening slightly. Vivian's smug expression cracked. The auctioneer, momentarily stunned, recovered. We have an opening bid from Mr. Cruz. Do I hear? 200,000, Tom said smoothly. A murmur rippled through the ballroom. It was an aggressive opening bid, a clear power move. Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line. 250, she called out, not about to be outdone. Sandra, still processing, leaned in. Tom, you don't have to. He gave her a side glance, amusement flickering in his eyes. Oh, I know. She blinked. 300,000. 350. 400. The tension in the room escalated as Vivian and Tom volleyed bids back and forth. Vivian refused to lose, but Tom? Tom wasn't even breaking a sweat. By the time the bid hit 600,000, Vivian hesitated. Tom, without looking up, raised a hand. 1 million. The ballroom gasped. Vivian paled. She hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. Long enough for the auctioneer to strike the gavel. Sold. To Mr. Tom Cruise. Applause erupted. But the true victory wasn't the necklace. It was the way Vivian's carefully curated composure cracked. Just for a moment. Tom leaned toward Sandra, voice low enough for only her to hear. That should keep her busy. Sandra exhaled a laugh. You really didn't have to do that. He grinned. I know. Across the room, Vivian's nails dug into her palm. She had just been outplayed in front of everyone. But she wasn't finished yet. Because she still had one last trick up her sleeve. Secondary conflict. A deeper connection. As the auction wrapped up, the gala moved into its final phase. The networking and mingling. This was where the real business happened, where alliances were made, and where people like Vivian thrived. Sandra, needing a breath of fresh air, stepped away from the crowd and found herself on the balcony, overlooking the city lights. She barely had a moment to herself before Tom joined her, hands in his pockets, exuding the effortless charm that had made him a Hollywood icon. You all right? He asked, leaning against the railing beside her. She smiled faintly. Yeah, just tired of the games. He nodded, studying her. You handled yourself well. She let out a quiet chuckle. Did I? Because from where I was sitting, you did most of the handling. Tom shrugged. I just don't like bullies. There was something in his tone. Something deeper than just casual conversation. Sandra tilted her head. You've dealt with a lot of them, haven't you? He hesitated. Then with a small smirk he said, Hollywood isn't that different from this room. Just better lighting. She laughed, the tension in her shoulders easing. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, both of them outliers in a world that thrived on power plays and status. Then Sandra sighed. She's not done. Tom glanced back at the ballroom. I know. And sure enough, Vivian was moving. She had one final shot. And this time, she was going to make it count. Inside the grand ballroom, the tension was palpable. The rich socialites continued their hushed conversations, their curiosity barely concealed. Everyone had witnessed Tom Cruise effortlessly outmaneuver Vivian during the auction. But Vivian Kensington wasn't the kind of woman who accepted public humiliation. Not without a fight. Standing near the center of the room, she sipped her champagne, her mind racing. If she couldn't outbid Tom Cruise or intimidate Sandra Bullock, she'd destroy them another way, with words. She glanced around, spotting several well-known media figures, journalists, high-profile influencers, and entertainment bloggers. A well-placed whisper in the right ear could turn the narrative against Sandra, making her the laughingstock of high society. And then an opportunity presented itself. Across the room, a microphone stood on a polished marble podium. The host had earlier invited notable guests to say a few words about the event's cause. Vivian's lips curled into a smug smirk. This was it. She set her champagne flute down and gracefully strode toward the podium. A few guests turned their heads, murmuring amongst themselves. No one had expected her to speak. Tapping the microphone, she smiled sweetly, her voice dripping with charm. "Ladies and gentlemen, what a spectacular evening we've had," she began, her voice smooth and practiced. "Such generosity, such elegance. And of course such surprises." Sandra, still standing near the balcony doors, tensed. Tom's gaze darkened. He knew a setup when he saw one. Vivian let the silence linger, ensuring all eyes were on her. Then, with feigned innocence, she continued. "It's always so fascinating to see new faces at events like these. Especially those who don't quite belong." A few scattered chuckles. Others exchanged uncertain glances. Sandra clenched her jaw. Vivian gave a delicate shrug, as if she wasn't aiming at anyone in particular, though everyone knew exactly who she was targeting. Of course, we all admire a good underdog story. A woman who rises above her station, attending events that, well, are perhaps a little out of reach. It's so inspiring. More laughter. This time harsher. Sandra felt the weight of their stares, their judgment. She had endured this kind of treatment before. Being underestimated, being patronized. But tonight it stung differently. Because it wasn't just her. Tom was being dragged into it too. Vivian's eyes glimmered with amusement. She could feel the shift in the room, the murmurs growing. She had successfully planted the seed of doubt, suggesting that Sandra was a nobody, an imposter in their world. And then she decided to strike the final blow. But truly, the highlight of my evening was watching certain guests. She glanced at Tom, her smile tightening. Go to great lengths to protect a friend. It's admirable, really. Chivalry is alive and well. Though one has to wonder, is it charity or pity? A sharp, collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Tom moved. He didn't storm the stage. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. Instead, he walked with the calm confidence of a man who owned the room. By the time he reached the center, the crowd had fallen silent. Even Vivian froze, sensing that something had shifted. Tom stopped a few feet away from the podium, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. Then in the coolest, most controlled voice imaginable, he said, "You done?" The room held its breath. Vivian blinked. "Excuse me." Tom tilted his head, eyes flickering with amusement. "I mean, was that the best you've got? Because I expected more." A few quiet chuckles. Vivian stiffened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Tom sighed, as if genuinely disappointed. Then he looked around the room, making sure everyone was watching. "Let me get this straight. You're trying to humiliate Sandra Bullock, one of the most talented, accomplished, and generous women in this room. Because what? She doesn't flaunt her wealth the way you do." A few heads turned toward Vivian, eyes narrowing. Tom let out a small chuckle. "You act like she's beneath you. But here's what's funny." He took a step forward, lowering his voice just enough to draw everyone in. "Do you even know who owns the company that sponsors half your events?" Vivian's smile faltered. Tom raised a brow. "No. Thought so." He casually reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped on the screen. Within seconds, an email appeared on the massive digital display behind them. The crowd gasped. Because there it was. A direct sponsorship agreement. The logo of the primary corporate sponsor of the night's event. And underneath it, the signature of the real owner, Sandra Bullock. A ripple of shock ran through the room. The very woman Vivian had tried to humiliate was the one funding half the gala. Vivian went pale. Sandra, meanwhile, remained perfectly composed, though there was a quiet, knowing amusement in her expression. Tom turned back to the audience, his voice smooth and sharp. "So if we're talking about who belongs here," he looked at Vivian, his smirk razor sharp. "Sandra Bullock isn't the guest. You are." A heavy silence. Then applause. It started slow, uncertain, then grew. One by one, the attendees realized the truth. They had laughed, gossiped, judged, without knowing that the woman they dismissed was the very reason this event was happening. Vivian took a shaky step back, her confidence shattered. Sandra finally stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Vivian, if you ever need funding for another one of your events, I'll consider it." The room erupted. Tom grinned. Mic drop. And Vivian? She had nothing left to say. The ballroom was electric. The applause wasn't just polite. It was genuine, filled with admiration and disbelief. Vivian Kensington stood frozen, her fingers clutching the edge of the podium, as if it could hold her together. Her perfect social facade had shattered. She had spent the entire night trying to undermine Sandra Bullock, only to realize she had been punching up the whole time. Sandra was the real power in the room. The same socialites who had laughed at Sandra earlier were now avoiding Vivian's gaze. Some even took slow steps away from her, as if proximity to her would taint their own reputations. And then the final blow came. One of the event coordinators stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. He held a printed document in his hands, and though his face was polite, his eyes betrayed a hint of satisfaction. "Miss Kensington," he said, adjusting his glasses, "we regret to inform you that your foundation's partnership with tonight's sponsors will be reevaluated." A murmur rippled through the audience. Vivian's breath hitched. "What?" The coordinator hesitated, then continued. "Given recent events, we believe it's in the best interest of our sponsors to reconsider their association with individuals who do not align with the values of generosity and inclusivity." It was diplomatic, but everyone knew what it meant. Vivian's funding was gone. Her carefully constructed empire, built on connections and influence, had just collapsed in real time. Tom Cruise, standing effortlessly composed, watched as realization dawned in Vivian's eyes. He almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But before Vivian could protest, Sandra finally spoke. "Vivian." It wasn't said with malice. No arrogance. No need for revenge. Just calm, unshakable confidence. Vivian forced herself to look up. Sandra took a small step forward, her voice as steady as ever. "I don't hold grudges, but I do believe in consequences." Vivian swallowed hard. She had nothing left to say. The weight of the moment crushed her, and with what little dignity she had left, she turned sharply on her heel and walked out of the ballroom. The room remained silent as the doors clicked shut behind her. Then cheers erupted. Tom glanced at Sandra, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. "That went well." Sandra let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "I didn't plan for this, you know." Tom tilted his head. "Didn't you?" Sandra didn't answer. She just turned back toward the crowd as guests lined up to shake her hand, finally seeing her for who she truly was. For the first time that night she belonged. And she always had. The echoes of the applause still rang in Sandra's ears as she stepped off the stage, her heart racing. Not with nerves anymore, but with something deeper. Relief. Resolution. Freedom. She had spent years shrinking herself down in rooms like this, trying to fit into a world that never truly saw her. Tonight, she had stood tall. Not because she had wanted to prove something, but because the truth could no longer be hidden. As she made her way through the crowd, people who had once dismissed her now looked at her with admiration or guilt. "Ms. Bullock, I just want to say, Sandra, please. And don't worry about it." She smiled at the woman who had whispered about her earlier in the night. There was no need for apologies. The lesson had already been learned. As the guests mingled, Tom Cruise appeared at her side, hands in his pockets, watching her with that trademark half-smirk. "Well, that was an interesting evening," he said. Sandra let out a soft laugh. "I didn't exactly plan for all of that to happen." Tom gave her a sideways glance. "Maybe not. But you handled it like someone who did." Before she could respond, a young woman hesitantly approached. "Ms. Bullock. I mean Sandra?" Sandra turned, recognizing the waitress from earlier, the one Vivian had belittled. She looked nervous but determined, her tray now set aside. "I just wanted to say thank you." Sandra frowned slightly. "For what?" The waitress bit her lip before answering. "For proving that people like me don't have to stay invisible." Sandra felt something tighten in her chest. This night had been about so much more than a ruined dress or a public humiliation. It had been about power, the kind that doesn't come from wealth, but from standing in your truth. She reached out and squeezed the young woman's hand. "You were never invisible." The girl's eyes shimmered, and for the first time that night, Sandra realized This was bigger than just her. Across the room, Vivian Kensington sat in a quiet corner, gripping a champagne flute like it was her last anchor to dignity. Her carefully built reputation had crumbled in less than an hour. The invitations she once took for granted? Gone. The whispers that used to follow others? Now surrounded her. She glanced toward Sandra, who was graciously accepting the respect Vivian had once hoarded for herself. For the first time, a thought struck her. Maybe power had never been about exclusion. Maybe it had been about presence. And Sandra Bullock had it. In abundance. Vivian clenched her jaw and looked away, not quite ready to face what that meant. As the night wound down, the ballroom emptied, but Sandra lingered for a moment. She looked around at the now silent room, remembering how different it had felt just hours ago. Tom stepped beside her, hands still tucked into his pockets. You know, he mused. I think you just changed a lot of things tonight. Sandra exhaled slowly, a small smile forming. Maybe. Tom tilted his head. So what's next? She turned to him, her gaze steady. I think it's time I stopped letting people decide where I belong. Tom grinned. Took you long enough. Sandra laughed, and for the first time in a long time, she felt weightless. Tonight hadn't just been about a gala. It had been about stepping into who she was meant to be. And that was just the beginning. The grand ballroom, once alive with chatter and status games, had emptied. Only a few staff members remained, clearing away crystal glasses and silk napkins. Sandra took one last glance at the room, the place where she had once felt like an outsider. Not anymore. She belonged anywhere she chose to be. Tom stood beside her, his presence as steady as ever. Ready? He asked. Sandra smiled. More than ever. As they stepped outside, the cool night air wrapped around them. The city lights stretched endlessly ahead, a reminder that the world was much bigger than the artificial circles of the elite. A black car pulled up to the curb. The same valet who had dismissed her earlier that night now rushed to open the door with deep respect. Sandra hesitated for just a second, not out of doubt, but reflection. Tonight had changed things. Not just for her, but for the people who had watched, listened, and learned. The waitress who finally saw her own worth. The guests who realized that true power wasn't in money, but in character. Even Vivian, who, despite everything, had been given a mirror to her own actions. Would she change? Maybe. Maybe not. That wasn't Sandra's burden to carry. She had her own future to claim. Sandra turned to Tom, who was already watching her with an amused look. What? She asked, raising an eyebrow. He chuckled. I was just wondering what you'll do now that you've effortlessly destroyed a social hierarchy in one night. Sandra laughed. Oh, I'm not destroying anything. Just rewriting the rules. With that, she stepped into the car, leaving behind the old version of herself, the one who had ever thought she wasn't enough. As the vehicle pulled away, Tom leaned back, a satisfied smirk still on his face. He had always known exactly who she was. It was about time the world knew too.